Welcome to the Joyful Noise Employee Manual Training Module number 6. This portion of the Joyful Noise Employee Manual provides all of the answers to the companion worksheet you have received. Please sign and date your paper at the top and fill out the answers as you go. From the Joyful Noise Employee Manual on page 19, Abuse Prevention Policy. Joyful Noise Abuse Prevention Policy is intended to prevent abuse and serve as the standard for which we interact with children at our center. Please also see the JN Employee Handbook under the title heading Employee Conduct. At Joyful Noise, we are committed to maintaining a safe environment in which children and youth are protected from abuse and/or neglect of any kind. It is important to note that the policy requires all staff members to not only recognize the definitions and warning signs of such abuse, but also to report to the proper authorities all cases alleging child abuse, including physical, emotional, and sexual abuse or neglect of a child. Joyful Noise requires this reporting and mandates its staff to report on all of these cases. From the Joyful Noise Employee Manual, pages 19 through 20. Definition of physical abuse. The National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect defines child physical abuse as the physical injury or maltreatment of a child under the age of 18 by a person who is responsible for the child's welfare under circumstances which indicate that the child's health or welfare is harmed or threatened thereby. Definition of sexual abuse. The National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect defines child sexual abuse as contacts or interactions between a child and an adult when the child is being used for sexual stimulation of the perpetrator or another person, when the perpetrator or another person is in a position of power or control over the victim. Sexual abuse is any time that a child is engaged in a sexual situation with an older person. It can include actual physical contact, such as fondling or rape, but it also includes using suggestive or sexual language with a child, making a child watch sexual acts or pornography, using a child in any aspect of the production of pornography, or making a child look at an adult's genitals. Definition of emotional abuse. The National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect defines emotional abuse as acts or omissions by the parents or other caregivers that have caused or could cause serious behavioral, cognitive, emotional, or mental disorders. In some cases of emotional abuse, the acts of parents or other caregivers alone, without any harm evident in the child's behavior or condition, are sufficient to warrant Child Protective Services intervention. For example, the parents, caregivers may use extreme or bizarre forms of punishment, such as confinement of a child in a dark closet. Less severe acts, such as habitual scapegoating, belittling, or rejecting treatment, are often difficult to prove, and therefore CPS may not be able to intervene without evidence of harm to the child. Emotional abuse. Scapegoating. Let's take a look at an example of scapegoating. Be mindful of behaviors such as scapegoating, blaming, and bullying when working with children. These are forms of emotional abuse. Emotional abuse. Let's take a look at negative labeling. What is wrong with this dialogue concerning the child's negative behavior? Positive guidance. Empowering with change. What is more positive about this dialogue? Verbal and emotional abuse. Let's take a look at excessive volume. Be mindful of your tone and volume. Excessively harsh manners or speaking in loud volumes can be considered verbal and/or emotional abuse. From the Joyful Noise Employee Manual, pages 19 through 20. Definition of verbal abuse. Verbal abuse, a facet of emotional abuse, is defined as any language or form of verbal harassment that may belittle, scare, emotionally harm, or terrorize a child. Examples of verbal abuse include, but are not limited to, sarcasm. Children do not understand sarcasm or sarcastic tones, and interpret language literally. Sarcastic language or tones when speaking to students is unacceptable and considered verbal abuse at our center. Name-calling, verbal bullying, or scapegoating. Referring to any child by a derogatory name is considered both verbal and emotional abuse. So is yelling, scapegoating, or referring to children as naughty, especially in their presence. Scapegoating is the practice of habitually blaming a child for actions that they may not be responsible for. Scapegoating is damaging to the self-esteem of a child and their social relationship with both peers and adults. Harsh tones, volume, or alarming noises. Loud words, angry yelling, or any sort of aggressive tone when speaking to or interacting with children will not be tolerated and will be considered verbal abuse. From the Joyful Noise Employee Manual, page 20. Employee and volunteer screening. In order to assure protection for minors and prevent abuse from happening, all adult positions at Joyful Noise, both paid and volunteer, will be screened for previous abuse offenses. This may include one or more of the following: completing a volunteer profile form, obtaining references, criminal record clearance, protective services screening, and an interview. Information obtained by Joyful Noise regarding the background of applicants prior to or during their service will be kept confidential. All potential staff people, including volunteers, will complete an application for employment or volunteer application and interview. All references will be checked along with applicants' past work history. Prior criminal convictions will be checked through the Michigan State Police, and we will ask about prior convicted crimes other than traffic violations. History of child abuse or neglect will be checked through a protective services screening. Applicant will be asked about involvement in child abuse of any kind, both in writing on our employment application and verbally through an interview. No person will be allowed to work with children if he or she has ever been involved in abuse, neglect, or criminal activity. From the Joyful Noise Employee Manual, page 20. Abuse Prevention Policy Notification. All employees are required to read the abuse prevention policy in this employee manual and the manual in its entirety, and will also be required to sign, amongst others, the employee policy signature page stating that they have read this portion of our policies and all policies within the employee manual and will adhere to it. Worker supervision. Each program conducted by Joyful Noise that involves minors is required to have and maintain operating procedures that will prevent and protect children and youth from being abused. Please see the Employee Manual under Caregiving Policies and Strategies in the appropriate physical, emotional, and verbal contact with children section below. From the Joyful Noise Employee Manual, page 21. Reporting obligations. All staff, administration, leaders, teachers, or anyone in a position representing Joyful Noise is required to report any suspected or alleged incidents of abuse within the school setting. It is not the responsibility of the reporting person to substantiate the alleged abuse, but only to report it. Joyful Noise requires all staff, administration, leaders, teachers, or any representatives to report alleged abuse cases involving minors to social services and law enforcement agencies. Records of reported incidents shall be maintained by a designated staff person. All matters pertaining to the accusation will be kept confidential by Joyful Noise. Response to allegations. When the allegation is made of abuse, the alleged offender must be informed of these allegations and must be suspended from participating in all service roles at Joyful Noise until an investigation is done by the proper authorities, protective services and/or local law enforcement agencies. Employment may or may not be reinstated. Review of policy. There is an annual review of all abuse policies, procedures, and requirements. Existing employees and volunteers will receive and read a copy of the abuse policy annually and information on any changes made in the policy, and be required to sign the abuse prevention policy signature sheet before employment or volunteering begins. Joyful Noise Employee Manual, page 21. Protection of Children. Every employee has a duty to report to the director any unusual marks, injuries, or bruises that they observe on a child. This may include unusual changes in a child's behavior or condition that could be symptoms of neglect or abuse. The director will deal with a parent or caregiver regarding such incidents. Employees will participate in annual child abuse prevention training. The director will handle all issues and concerns regarding matters of custody. If, at any time, a teacher is uncomfortable interacting with a parent or guardian regarding these matters, administrative support should be called upon. Please remember that in all circumstances, information regarding the situation is confidential and should be kept private with the exception of communication between parents, teachers, and the director. Please return your completed and signed worksheets at this time. Thank you for completing training module number 6.